Here in the Archdiocese of Brisbane, recently we have launched a reconciliation action plan. And the launch of that plan is a sign that we want a fresh and more powerful engagement with our First Nations people, who are a very, very important part of the life of the Archdiocese here, and not only the life of the Archdiocese, but they are a very important part of the life of the nation. So at the heart of our reconciliation plan, there is a commitment to listen to Indigenous voices. Now here we're going to engage in a kind of conversation. And it will be a conversation about the very complex question of Australia Day, which we celebrate on the 26th of January. Now there are many voices heard about Australia Day, and there's been considerable controversy in recent years about January the 26th and what it represents. Now our conversation here is not intended in any way to aggravate that controversy. So we're not here to listen to political speeches or ideological diatribes of any kind. We're here today to listen to human voices, and human voices that aren't jumping on a bandwagon, but are telling their story. So this is a moment of storytelling and a moment for us, for me and you, to listen to very, very human stories. And this is in the belief that truth-telling is at the heart of anything that's worthy of the name reconciliation. The truth, whatever it is, must be told. Because as Jesus says, the truth will set you free. And we are, in the search for reconciliation, we are kind of looking for a new freedom. First of all, for our First Nations people, that for them Australia fair may also be Australia free. So this is really a moment of truth-telling, storytelling, and listening. But we have with us three First Nations people. We have Cynthia Rowan, Dean Parkin, and Sabrina Stevens, each with their story to tell. Now, Cynthia, I might allow you to introduce yourself, and then Dean perhaps, and then Sabrina. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are and where you're from, and then I'm going to retire to silence and listen to the stories that you have to tell about your experience, the truth of your experience of Australia Day, and what we, people like me, might learn from the story that you tell.
Thank you, Your Grace. I'm a Birragubba woman. My grandmother's country is now referred to as the Whitsundays. And I've never had an opportunity to live and practice my culture on my country. And I'll just hand over to Dean.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Archbishop. My name is Dean Parkin. I'm from the Quandamooka peoples from Mindirribah, or North Stradbroke Island, just off the coast of Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of traditional owners here, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present as well, and bring greetings from my own peoples, including those of my mother, who many of you know, Evelyn Parkin, who's been very active in the church and in our communities for many, many years. And a lot of the experience that I draw upon is obviously my own, but a lot of the teachings that I've had very much come from her and very much continue to this day, which I'm eternally grateful for. So I might just leave my introduction there and pass over to Sabrina.
My name is Sabrina Stevens, and I'm a Kuku-Yalanji and Yidinji woman from Cairns in far north Queensland.
So that's who we're listening to today. So again, let's focus upon the question at hand. What has been your experience of January the 26th?
Well, has the youngest in the group, no, only joking, has the eldest in the group, you know, I don't recall as a child attending school in the early 60s, whether we really participated, or even in the neighbourhood, has the school ever participating in Australia Day or any reference to it. We were the only Aboriginal children in the school of about 400 students, and so it wasn't an issue as a primary school student. And later on in life, it was never anything significant for me or for my family. We went to the Anzac Day March and supported the returned servicemen. That was significant for us as a family. I don't recall until my son was going to school in the 80s where he was talking about and dealing with Australia Day, but again, he was with his mates. The most significant time it became really apparent for me, I'm not against a celebration for Australia, but it was the date. And leading up to the bicentenary, that's where that awakening arose amongst Aboriginal people in different parts of Australia. And we came together to march for freedom, justice and peace. We were very clear when we went down there for that gathering of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people. In the bicentennial year of 1988, we gathered at La Perouse. They provided food for all the travellers, and all of the churches arranged for parishioners to provide billeted accommodation for us. So there was some really interesting experience, but the thing that was quite clear, and it surprised me, actually I shouldn't be surprised, but I often think this is what I marched for in 1988, so what has changed now? There was passionate supporters then. There are more passionate supporters for the truth-telling, but more importantly, the recognition that it's not the problem with celebrating Australia Day, it's the date that's chosen. Because when we participated in that event, it wasn't just a march of 30,000 people, but we had an all-night ceremony at Kurnell Point. And then in the morning and the dawning of the 27th of January, there was a smoking ceremony for all the participants. But that was a healing night to heal the part of the country where the rot started, as some of the elders referred to that landing at Kurnell Point. So this is where the badness started for Aboriginal people in this country or continent now called Australia. So for us, the significance was as Aboriginal nations from all around the country came together, they danced and they sang in their own language, and that went all night. So you weren't to the special protocols around it, but for me as a young woman, that was so significant an event. And so the march, sure, it was a lot of people and there were speeches at Hyde Park and things like that, but it was nothing compared to the sacredness and the hope and aspirations of Aboriginal people from that event. With the march, we was hoping to make an impact for people to stop and think about, well, if we're talking about us as a country, what is significant? So that was for me in 1988. So Sabrina, what would be the significant time for you?
When I think back, I can't ever think of a moment in time where I've actively celebrated Australia Day. My first encounter, I guess, that I remember of January 26th was a survival day in Sydney when I was 10 years old. And that was the first time in my life that I'd attended an event that really opened my eyes to the contrast between Australia Day celebrations and Survival Day or Invasion Day celebrations, or commemorations perhaps. So I remember in school it was a day that you get off, but it was also a day where a lot of people that I knew were celebrating citizenship ceremonies. So it wasn't anything that was a day of significance for me, Australia Day as it is, growing up at all.
Where did Survival Day come from? I've heard Invasion Day, but I've never heard Survival Day before.
I am unsure where it stems from, but my understanding of it is that it's about celebrating the survival of some of the oldest living cultures in the world that still exist and are living on country today. So I think for me personally, language is a very strong and important tool in the way that you can view the world and perceive things. So I prefer a Survival Day over Invasion Day, but that's just me personally.
Dean, what's your memory of Australia Day?
Yeah, I think mine's come in sort of two phases. So the first phase was, I mean, I don't remember any significance at all growing up as a kid. Similarly, there wasn't a sense that this was a day as a family growing up that had significance, that meant that we were celebrating something actively. I remember the Anzac Day dawn services. I remember being part of those, but nothing around Australia Day as a moment to remember. In my late teens, as I was leaving school and then going to university and playing footy with my mates, there was a period of time there where it was a day off. We'd go to somebody's place with a pool. We'd sit around the pool. We'd have a barbecue, play a bit of impromptu cricket or whatever else was going on, or head down to the beach. So it'd be a day to hang out with mates. Even then, it wasn't a day to sit there and talk about the significance of the date. Nobody cared about the date. The fact was, it was just a day off that you could hang out with your mates. And then, so that was probably the first phase. The more recent phase has been the way that I've responded over the last 10 or 15 years, I suppose, which is either do one or two things. They'll either go and march with other folk on the day, or attend a Survival Day event in Sydney of the like. That's one option. Or now, more often, stay at home, switch off all the social media, bunker down, and protect myself from a lot of the jingoism that goes on in and around the date. And it's actually something that I feel coming on the calendar. It's not just all the days leading up and then it pops up on the day. It's something that builds as it gets closer, as something to almost bunker down and away from. To
protect yourself.
Yeah.
It's a powerful phrase, that.
Yeah.
I mean, you experience it as some kind of attack, therefore.
It's more about just personal well-being and spiritual well-being and feeling good, or at least just creating that space for myself, not to be or feel in any way provoked or triggered by some of the expressions that go on in and around Australia Day that I don't share and don't feel that I can share at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. Where are the marches held that you mentioned?
Every capital city around the country will have their own march. Yeah, I've marched in several cities.
The first march process was a day of mourning in, I think it was 1936.
38.
38 in Melbourne.
See, this is where I'm shamed by my own ignorance, and this is just typical, certainly of my generation. I mean, you know, it was as if the First Nations people were invisible. Mm. Didn't have a history, didn't have an identity.
Well, the whole concept of Australia Day started with a woman in Sydney. 3 of her sons were in the army, and she was looking at it as a way to raise funds for the soldiers that were overseas. Mm. But the protest, I think, that was in Melbourne is when they really started looking at the date, because they called it a day of mourning, as Aboriginal people did, because of what was happening with Aboriginal people, the massacres, the arsenic, and all of those things that had occurred. Because Queensland, in frontier wars, there's thousands of people that were massacred in this state. So it's not about asking people to feel guilty. It's about, if we're a mature nation and we're a multicultural nation, how is Australia to be inclusive of it? And we're talking about truth-telling for the wider community. So the wider community needs to understand why Aboriginal people like us don't participate in that day because of the date. It's not that we don't see ourselves as part of this nation, that we're making a significant contribution to, but it's talking about, well, we need to have that maturity in this modern Australian society to really look at a date that's significant for all Australians, because it's like an insult and a slap in the face to keep having it on this date, because we're remembering that this was the beginning when we started to do all of these horrible things to Aboriginal people.
The history of it's really important, because you sometimes hear now some people saying, oh, I'm really tired of seeing these marches. Why can't we all just come together? Why is this? As if it's a recent phenomenon. As Cynthia said, the Day of Mourning was 1938. The concept of NAIDOC itself, that we celebrate every single year, came about because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were protesting before the 1920s about the 26th of January. And it was a recognition that their voices weren't being heard and that they needed to organise those voices into some sort of grouping. And that was the beginning of how the sort of coming together of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to organise our voices, to amplify those messages really started. And the NAIDOC celebrations that we enjoy every single year, we have to understand that started from a place of protest. And that's continued all this time right up until this date. So it's not a new phenomenon, and I think it points to the challenge that I think we're going to have with this concept of truth-telling, is that I know there's a lot of desire for this to happen, and I know there's a lot of people of great goodwill that want truth-telling to happen in a meaningful way, but we have to be very honest. We have to be very clear about how difficult this actually is to do well. We've been talking for more than 100 years. We've been protesting and marching and organising in big ways and in small ways for more than a century on the 26th of January. And we're still having those conversations. And it's not going away. This is the thing. It's not going to go away. It's only going to get more pronounced until we come together as a country and deal with it properly. And so that's an important thing to realise, that truth-telling doesn't come easy, and change as a result of that truth-telling is even harder. So, and to Cynthia's point before about what we're missing here on the 26th, Noel Pearson's talked about three traditions, or the three identities of Australia. There's the Indigenous heritage, the pre-1770, which obviously came from 65,000 years ago and continues to this day strong and proud. There is the British colonial history that came with the arrival of the first fleet in 1788. And then there is the subsequent waves of immigrants that have added to the richness and the diversity of who we are as a nation. And that's three parts of Australia, three very important parts. But the date as it sits at the moment only recognises one part. We're only recognising 1/3 of who we are as a nation. And so when you sit here today and realise that 30% of Australians have been born overseas, and we have these three heritages, the 26th of January is too narrow. Is too narrow. We're missing the opportunity to genuinely celebrate with all parts of who we are as a nation, and that's the opportunity that's here when we actually sit down and do this properly.
The whole thing of truth-telling being hard, the point you make, Dean, that is crucially important, I think. It is hard. It's hard for Indigenous people, at least I think it is, and correct me if I'm wrong, because what you're doing is often speaking out of trauma, and generational trauma too. But it's equally hard for people like me to hear the truth, because it's very often something we don't want to hear. So there are two aspects of the difficulty, both to tell the truth and for us to actually hear the truth, particularly because it's a painful truth that has to be told and heard.
And it's difficult in the lives we lead as well, simply because, at Mass during the Australia Day weekend, people come up and say, Happy Australia Day. And I don't want to be disrespectful because they want to celebrate. They don't know my history or where I'm coming from and what I experience and what I feel. They're just joyful for that. So I acknowledge that they're celebrating, but I don't respond Happy Australia Day to you. And it's not, and I'm trying to be thoughtful and respectful of their life experience and where they're coming from, that until people know and understand why, it's not just a political statement. It's about having a country that is truly unified on something that's fairly special for all of us. And when my grandchildren were growing up, they wanted to go and celebrate Australia Day with their mates and go and see the fireworks and everything. So as a nana, my responsibility was to support them and not stifle their joy in life. So I'd go along to the Australia Day fireworks at night, which sounds weird, but anyway, to support my grandchildren with their friends. So for an individual having to make choices what you do, that you're participating in something that your heart's not in it, but you're doing it for the people around you that you love. And so my grandchildren now, they wouldn't be seen anywhere near Australia Day, but they would go and watch and applaud the Anzac Day March. So, it's interesting. It's not that we demanded it. I haven't demanded it of my grandchildren. It's something they arrived at because of their life experience of racism, and regardless of whatever you do in life and what you achieve, you're always seen as an Aboriginal person that needs help and not have that capacity. So as a younger person, your life experience would have been quite different from mine.
Mm.
I think growing up, I had a lot of times where people would say, "Oh, like Happy Australia Day," or "Do you want to come to this Australia Day celebration?" But given the history of our nation, I don't feel that it's something that I can celebrate when I know that the intergenerational trauma of what occurred over those years is still affecting my family and my people today, like the people who I feel connected to.
But is Australia Day a different experience for younger Indigenous people like you, Sabrina, than it would be, say, for someone like Cynthia? Has it changed?
In my experience, no. I
Okay.
don't think it's changed, the notion around Australia Day celebrations. Yeah.
That point you made around the trauma of telling the truth is a real one. It's part of what makes it very difficult to tell. But there is that corresponding trauma of hearing it. And it's necessary. It's necessary. This is the thing. If in the telling of the truth there isn't a feeling of great discomfort in the people that are receiving that truth, the non-Indigenous people that hear that truth, nothing is going to change. If in the giving of the stories and the experience of the trauma in doing that doesn't have an effect in such a way that makes people hearing that feel a deep discomfort, but it's there. It is there. Many people I've spoken to have shared that, and there are many people that are very resistant to the idea that they should feel that way, that they should feel discomfort on hearing that truth. But that's the catalyst. That is the point at which change can be built from that. Because if it isn't, we're effectively saying we're okay with the way that the status quo is. That's just somebody else's really sad story. It's got nothing to do with me.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah.
That it's not me, it's somehow out there. And as long as that attitude remains powerful, as it is, there won't be any cultural or attitudinal change. And that's really what we're looking for, it seems to me at least. What would your hopes for the future be in terms, of change? What are you looking for? I mean, some of this, Dean, I know is caught up with the Uluru Statement, and you're very involved in that. And we've endorsed it here in the Archdiocese of Brisbane. The Australian bishops, you would have seen, endorsed it as a conference of bishops the other day. And there does seem to be a bit of momentum for change. I've certainly had a strong feeling myself of enough is enough. So what are your hopes for the future of Australia Day certainly, but more generally?
I would love to see young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people having access to the education that they need, to the jobs that they need as well, to just having access to equal infrastructure and equitable infrastructure as well to support them on their journey moving forward in this nation. And if that's university, then that's where it's at, And I just think that education is an important key that should be supported for all young people to be able to better their lives and move forward together, as a nation.
Just with education, like most of the unis in southeast Queensland have up to and over 1,000 Indigenous students starting from undergraduate to postgraduate. So, you're looking at Queensland University, QUT, and things like that. So there's a lot of people that's studying and that's in the workforce. I was marching for education in the early 80s. Access to education, because you educate today for tomorrow. And education is not necessarily university degrees. It's having that opportunity to do training and to go into different trades and things like that. So one of the unfortunate things about this country is the overt and covert racism. And it's part of that that mentality of how women are treated, how people are treated from different countries. Because when you have when the immigrants were coming from Vietnam after the Vietnamese war, they suffered a lot of racism. Then you had the next wave of people coming in and they suffered a lot of racism. And so they heap it on the next lot that comes in. But for Aboriginal people, we get it all the time. So my hope for the future is that when we're talking about these things and having the adult conversation, not a them and us mentality, but having that intelligent conversation about, well, how can we contribute as individuals to this rich, diverse Australia that we're proud to celebrate? Because we're no longer a little island community. We're part of the world, and the world is watching what has been happening to Aboriginal people over the years. And we didn't support the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples through United Nations. We was one of the countries that said no, and it took a while before we stepped up and said yes. So it's about us as a nation. So it's all of the voters and it's all the young people coming through, because our contribution is for their future. So we need to stop the them and us mentality and have that intellectual discussion about what is a date that includes everyone in Australia, not just the descendants of the British colonies.
on the 26th of January, I hope we can move through this sooner. I hope we're not here in another 100 years still having this debate. I don't think we will. I think this is something that will come about as a result of more and more Australians joining that push. But I don't underestimate that will take some time. So I think we're going to be seeing this for a few more years at least yet. But more broadly, it's one part of this challenge, as we talked about, in terms of the truth telling. And when I think about truth telling, it's not just about the telling and the hearing, it's about the doing. It's the acting differently. And in our situation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, it is about the deep truth telling that's needed to address the big challenges facing our communities, be it education, be it health, be it housing, all of these things that we're seeing now in the way that our communities are really up against it with COVID. As the rest of the country is starting to clock off, as we hit 80% vaccination rates, our communities are gearing up now for devastation. And it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be that way. We're 2 years in. We've known all along that our communities were vulnerable, and yet here we are, worried about what's going to happen, particularly with those people in those regional and remote areas. Part of what needs to happen as a result of truth telling more generally is change. We can't have a situation where 1991 we have the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, a very, very powerful mechanism for truth telling. You can be compelled to be a witness at a Royal Commission. People can be effectively forced to give evidence. It's one of the strongest mechanisms we have. And 30 years on after that, the proportion of our people in prison has doubled in that time. So it's not just about the telling and the hearing of the truth, it has to be about change. That's why the Uluru Statement was and is so important. That's why Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people talked about truth telling and treaty. And it's why we said first we need to make sure that we have that voice in place, because that voice is going to be the mechanism, the constitutionally guaranteed voice is going to be the mechanism that allows us a seat at the table to ensure that these conversations around truth, be it on the 26th, be it on any other issue that's affecting our people, that we have a real say and we have a real opportunity to actually influence change. Because I don't want to be here sitting on a couch in 30 years' time, 40 years' time, having the same conversation. It's just not part of the way that I see the rest of my life. I don't think any of us should have that as an expectation. And so that's why we need that voice in place to make sure that when we think about these issues that are approaching, with the 26th or anything else, that we have a genuine seat at the table, and that's the opportunity that's before us. I believe we'll get there. We're well on the way, and hopefully we're going to be able to make more of an impact and have more of a say in changing the trajectory of our nation, because while it's been challenging for our past and will continue to remain challenging, there is an opportunity for us to think differently about ourselves as Australians and as a country, and with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at the centre of that. And so that's something that we should all be striving for together.
Yes, at the centre is I think crucial, because I have come to think more and more that the injustices done and still being done to First Nations people in this country are a running sore at the heart of the nation, and that there will always be a kind of original sin at the heart of Australia until there is some genuine healing and reconciliation, all of which requires that painful process of truth-telling. What we have done here today is important, but it's small. It's been a moment to listen and to learn. I certainly have learnt about the history, things I didn't know. Going back 100 years, I didn't realise any of that. But see, my generation, and perhaps many of you who are watching this, there's this kind of unconscious assumption that the history of Australia only began once the Europeans began landing on these shores. There was no history before that, when in fact there was all kinds of history. But similarly, even with the question of Australia Day, there is a pre-history to this in this country. It hasn't come out of nowhere or just since 1988. I mean, that was obviously a very important moment. But there's all that story that you've told, Dean, about the kind of thing that's been going on consciously and unconsciously at the heart of Australia. So we might rest it there, not thinking that we have come up with magic answers or political solutions. That was never the point of this conversation. But we have put before you the need to listen to Indigenous voices, human voices, and to listen to stories, because in the end, the stories that are told by people like Sabrina and Dean and Cynthia are our story. And we can only discover just how true that is it is our story, the Indigenous story, that we can find our way to things like healing and reconciliation as more than just words. Well, now is the time for us to start asking what is something we might do, however simple, that might actually make things not worse but better, so that Australia fair may in fact be Australia free for everybody, for a whole nation. So thank you, Sabrina, thank you, Dean, and thank you, Cynthia, for the truth that you have spoken, and let's all of us go further along the path of truth, the truth that will set us free.